Corner seam. Most garments don't require a corner seam. It is usually for products like a pillow, cushion, covers or bags that you require a corner seam. If you know the corner seam, then making of a pillow or cushion becomes very easy. So it is worthwhile to know the corner seam. And it is this corner seam that we are going to learn in this class. Objectives: at the end of this class, you will be able to identify a corner seam, sew a corner seam. What is a corner seam? Corner seam is a type of plain seam. This is what it looks like. Corner seams are not very common, but it is good to know how to make this seam when needed, as for example, when making a pillow cover. Let's see how to do a corner seam on a sample. Procedure of sewing a corner seam. You will need the following items to do this sample: cotton fabric, straight ruler,
pattern square,
straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of cotton fabric. Measure and draw 10 by 10 square on it with the help of a ruler,
pattern square,
measuring tape, and tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Now take one of the fabric pieces and lay it on the table with its wrong side up. Using a
pattern square,
measuring tape, and tailor's chalk, mark 1 inch seam allowance on this piece along 2 crossing sides. Now pin the 2 pieces with the right side together with the marked seam line on the upper side. Step 3. Stitch the seam and the corner. Now we will start stitching. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Leave the reverse stitch lever and stitch along the seam line with a normal stitch length. When coming closer to the corner, stop the machine and with the help of the stitch length regulator, make your stitching length shorter. Cornered seam is reinforced by using a shorter stitch length on either side of the corner. Then continue in a slow pace and stop the machine 1 stitch length before the corner when the needle is inside the fabric. Now turn the cloth 45 degrees. Accurate pivoting is important to get an accurate corner. Using the hand wheel, make 1 stitch so that the needle enters the stitching line 1 stitch after the corner. Turn and continue about 8 more stitches and stop and lengthen the stitching length to normal using the stitch length regulator and finish the seam. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with a reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 4. Press the seam. Press the seam line with an iron. Step 5. Trim the corner seam allowance. On enclosed corners, one needs to eliminate seam allowance bulk at the point so that when the project is turned right side out, the corner will lie smooth and flat without bulges. So trim the seam allowance at the corner point by first cutting seam allowance slightly away from the stitched line, leaving about 2 to 3 mm. Then trim the sides in an angle to the corner. Step 6. Turn it over. Now turn it over. Open the fabric and the seam allowance so that the right sides of the fabric are no longer together, but the wrong sides are together instead. Step 7. Again, press the seam. Then press the seam with an iron. Finally, you have your sample with the corner seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purposes only so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching to the fabric. There is another way of fine-tuning the corners, especially if the fabric is thin and is fraying a lot. Then instead of trimming, the seam allowance can be folded neatly while turning the two fabric pieces with the corner over. Finally, you also have a sample of a corner seam with the corners folded neatly instead of trimming the seam allowance. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. Corner seam is a plain seam and is not very common. The procedure of sewing the corner seam, let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Step 3. Stitch the seam and the corner. Step 4. Press the seam line. Step 5. Trim the corner seam allowance. Step 6. Turn it over. Step 7. Again, press the seam. This is the corner seam. So now you have learned all about the corner seam. Take our next class to learn about the inserted corner seam.